Good evening. Welcome to the digital channel of the Instituto Cervantes, Manchester and Leeds. It is a great honor to have you as our audience in an event that it is especially important for us, as it is the beginning of the series Duende, the International Journeys of Flamenco, in which Professor Carlos van Tongeren will help us to understand and enjoy flamenco by deepening our knowledge of it. When we think about flamenco, Kenya is perhaps not the first country that comes to mind, although it is a nation where one of the great milestones of this novel musical genre happened in 2010. In that date, Nairobi was announced that flamenco had been included in the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity from the UNESCO. The importance of intangibility cultural heritage is not only the cultural manifestation in itself, but also the wealth of knowledge and skills that it's transmitted through it from one generation to the next. Such significant recognition also highlights its national and international importance. For example, there are more flamenco schools in Japan than in Spain. As stated by Manuel Boorquez, in a way that recognition was like a wake-up call similar to the iconic 1922 Concurso de Cante Hondo de Granada, promoted by Manuel de Falla and García Lorca, and it was a reminder that to the world that there is an art gender worth minding. Flamenco represents a wide, complex, and multidimensional reality. These differences in flamenco are extensive, including where it takes place, who does it, what authenticity it is, and what the art complex entails. Flamenco is a tradition composed of a wide variety of genders, styles, conventions, creative aesthetics, identities, and performances context. In order to understand the exciting and complex world of flamenco, we begin today this international flamenco journey in which Professor Carlos van Tongeren, in a series of 4 lectures, will show us the reality of flamenco in Africa, in America, Asia, and Europe. Before I give him the word, I would like to introduce Carlos van Tongeren. He is a lecturer in Spanish in cultural studies at the University of Manchester. His research deals with issues of memory, performance, and music in modern Spanish culture, in particular since the end of Franco's dictatorship. His next book is tentatively called Flamenco After Franco, Performances of Memory in the Spanish Transition, in which he studies how the multidisciplinary language of flamenco has offered ways for artists to voice personal and collective memories of the Franco dictatorship. His previous publications on flamenco had appeared in an academic journal such as the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies and Studies in Spanish and Latin American Cinemas. I hope you will enjoy this evening. And at the end of it, if you have any question, you can put it in the chat and then I will ask Carlos. So now Carlos van Tongeren has the floor. Thank you very much to all for being there.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for your very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. It's a great pleasure to be able to share some ideas and to share some of my recent work about flamenco with all of you. I'm hoping for this to be a bit of an an interactive session. So rather than it being a lecture in which I'm going to speak and speak and speak, I also hope for you to ask any questions, and maybe afterwards we can have a debate, a discussion. All of the ideas that I'm going to present here today are very much part of a new and ongoing process, work that I'm currently doing. So I'm really not pretending to present some sort of finalized story here about the connections of flamenco with cultural traditions from all over the globe. This is very much a work in progress, and I'm sure that I can also learn from all of your perspectives and all of your ideas about this massively complex and but also interesting topic. Thanks as well to Carlos Pulpillo for arranging all of this and helping out with the technology, and for also for the kind invitation, him and Pedro for the kind invitation to speak here today. So, well, Pedro has already introduced me a little bit, but I feel I need to add a little bit about my own background to get this conversation started. And let me first share my screen with you. I feel I need to say a little bit more about myself because, well, I have a Spanish name, but I'm originally from the Netherlands. My surname kind of reveals that as well. I have a Spanish name because my parents are flamenco aficionados. They both love Spain and have been to Spain many times. So they decided, because of their passion for Spanish culture, to give me a Spanish name as well. And they have, you know, loads of records at home. They really like flamenco, have been listening to it for many decades. And basically that helped me get started as well with my own journey as a scholar of flamenco, but also as a flamenco guitarist. So I first went to Spain on my own when I was 18 to take flamenco guitar classes with Manolo Sanlúcar, and that was an amazing experience that that basically, well, changed my life, right? And after that, I've just continued playing guitar very intensively, studied in Spain for several years, and now at the University of Manchester, I've also started working on different research projects on flamenco. And I'm saying all of this not because I think my personal biography is massively interesting or whatever. I just feel that it's important to start a conversation as well about ways in which we, when we're not from Spain or from Andalusia, and go to Spain to learn flamenco, to try to immerse ourselves into that culture. That obviously, that is a very interesting journey. As I just said, it can change our lives in many positive ways, but it also comes with all sorts of issues and struggles and challenges, right? For example, not being from Spain and not being from Andalusia poses important questions in terms of how are you going to relate to a musical culture that initially you feel is not really your own culture? How are you going to behave in front of people that speak a different language, that may not share the same cultural frameworks, that may have other ideas about what is important in terms of how a musical culture should be practiced and those kinds of things. So it also comes with challenges in terms of my own sense of belonging to a certain country, a certain culture. And I think that is a feeling that many students, practitioners, performers of flamenco have when they arrive at Spain and feel that somehow flamenco is very interesting and a beautiful musical culture. But it's also very complex, and not only complex because it's very challenging to play or to dance or to sing, but also challenging because somehow there's this suggestion that's always somehow in the air that if you're not from Spain or if you're not from Andalusia, then you're never really going to be able to really have access to it. It's always, there's also always going to be some sort of distance between you and the music that you feel is so important or can become so important for you. And I think it's important to take those kinds of issues seriously and to start thinking about them in a bit more detail and a bit more systematically as well. How can people nowadays relate to flamenco if they're not from Spain? How can people that may not speak the Spanish language still become participants of flamenco culture? In what ways can we even feel that we are part of that culture, and that flamenco is not only cultural heritage for the Gitano community in Spain or for Andalusia, but that it's also something that we can relate to as world heritage, right? Especially since it was declared on this very institutional kind of top-down level by the UNESCO. It was declared as world heritage. Does that mean that we as practitioners, students, artists, scholars can also become part of that heritage, and in what ways? Those are the kinds of challenges that I think we need to start dealing with, and questions that we need to start asking. And I hope that this first seminar is basically the start of a conversation in that respect as well. So today, since this is the first seminar in a series of 4 seminars, right? Let me start by giving you a very brief introduction to the series and to the overarching approach that I'm going to try and take to flamenco in this series. And then, since today we're going to talk about the connections between flamenco and the African continent, I'd like to say a little bit about the very complex debate about the origins of flamenco. Those debates have to do a lot with the African continent, and also with the legacy of the times of Al-Andalus, the Moorish or Islamic presence on the Iberian Peninsula between the 7th and the 15th centuries. The legacy of Al-Andalus, as I'll try to explain in this seminar, is related to flamenco in very complex ways, and often also idealized a little bit in order to suggest that flamenco somehow is this embodiment of peaceful coexistence between different religious and different cultural communities during the times of Al-Andalus. And that idea is still used for commercial purposes in the tourism industry and so on. This is a topic that has been researched by other scholars as well, and I'm going to refer to that work as well in that part of the discussion. Then I'll say a bit about a very interesting, challenging, and very exciting new aspect of flamenco studies, which is the topic of blackness in flamenco, a very silenced aspect of flamenco and of flamenco studies. So I think it's important to start saying something about that as well, with reference again to the work of other scholars that have worked on that topic. And I'll then quickly formulate a couple of conclusions before giving you a bit of a taste of what we're going to do in the second seminar, because they're all going to be connected. It's not going to be, I mean, what I'm going to say today, I would say cannot be entirely understood if we don't look at other aspects, other parts of the globe, which we're going to do in later seminars. So I think these 4 seminars are all connected. I'm going to try and speak to approximately 50 minutes, between 50 minutes and an hour, and then we'll have approximately 20 minutes or half an hour or so for discussion and for questions and so on. May I ask, because I'm hearing a bit of background noise, if everybody could please mute their microphones. It makes it a little bit easier to concentrate. If not, these sounds come into my headphones all the time. That makes it a bit difficult. Thanks. So the introduction to the seminar series, there are a couple of ideas that for me are in a way the starting point for this discussion. The first aspect is this picture that I received a couple of years ago from someone, a picture taken in Valencia. As you can see, this poster, this advertisement from the Ayuntamiento, no? City Council in Valencia, with the word flamenco crossed out. And then beneath the word flamenco, it says, "Es hora de cambiar los tópicos sobre España." It's time to change the tópicos, no? The stereotypes about Spanish culture. And I think this is something that is reflected on this billboard, but also in all sorts of ways. I think we can say that many people in Spain are a bit tired of these traditional stereotypes, the fact that everybody, when they talk about Spain, they automatically think of bullfighting, flamenco, playa, sangria, those kinds of things, right? It's quite a reductive way of understanding Spanish culture that many people really don't identify with. There are important historical reasons for that as well. the fact that flamenco was indeed born more or less in the late 19th century as some scholars have called it, form of pseudo folklore that was very much aimed at promoting a nationalistic kind of idea of Spanish culture for foreign visitors and also abroad. And that happened as well during the Franco dictatorship, especially since the start of the tourism industry in Spain, when the Franco regime started promoting and marketing Spanish culture abroad, building on and using all those very reductive stereotypes of, you know, these folkloristic images of Andalusian culture and the beaches, and flamenco is obviously also part of that. So that's why many people today in Spain still associate flamenco with backwardness, conservatism, and from a political point of view, even right-wing conservatism, something that they don't really identify themselves with. So I think that these people that made this poster have already indicated that it's time to start thinking about Spanish culture in a new way. And I would add, it's time to start thinking about flamenco in a new way as well. So given that it seems that inside of Spain, people are a bit tired of these stereotypes, are a bit tired of flamenco. And also what I tried to explain earlier, the fact that foreign visitors of Spain, foreign practitioners, foreign students of flamenco, they don't really identify themselves with this idea that flamenco and Spain are somehow intrinsically related. They feel that, and I include myself here, should we not have a right to identify ourselves with flamenco even if we're not Spanish, right? So I think from both points of view, both the national point of view in Spain and the international point of view, the relation between Spain and flamenco is a bit of an exhausted relationship. And I'm aware that it's a bit polemical to say that, but I think it might be interesting to start thinking about it in this way. Now, to add to that, a quotation from a French art historian and philosopher that I have found very inspiring, Georges Didier Berman, who has written a couple of not very well-known texts about flamenco. They are known in Spain because they have been translated from French into Spanish, but unfortunately, no English translations exist yet. So this art historian has come up with very interesting philosophical thoughts about flamenco as well, building upon a wider tradition of cultural philosophy in Europe, the work of Aby Warburg, Walter Benjamin, and other scholars that have also dealt with the development of different art forms across the ages. And this quotation from one of Didier Berman's texts about flamenco, I think sums up quite nicely what basically what I'm trying to do here, what I think we should try and talk about a bit more. This is a quotation, it's my translation of the quotation, that has to do with the question of the earth, soil, or tierra in Spanish, right? Which has been so important in Spanish, in flamenco, the idea that flamenco is very much related to la tierra, and in particular, the tierra of Andalusia, right? So what Didier Berman says here is that when we ask about the original place where flamenco deep song was created, then basically we're asking a question, not only a question to which there is no real answer, but we're even creating a false problem when we're trying to think about the origins of a musical culture. And we're not really dealing with that question of origin in a real way. Because according to the philosophical tradition that Didier Berman follows, we shouldn't search for the origins of a musical culture in one fixed point in time. Origins are rather something that develop over time and that are something that is marked by movement. So he says it creates a false problem at the expense of a true metaphysics of origins. It would be much better to think about the depth, the thickness, or the extension, as he calls it, of this art form of flamenco in the terms in which Aby Warburg understood all cultural forms. And we should be looking at the moving geography and the way in which flamenco migrates through the centuries and through different cultural spaces, rather than trying to locate this one single point in time where supposedly flamenco was born or created or whatever, right? I think that's a very interesting way of thinking about this. And in order to put this in perhaps slightly easier terms, we should not be looking at the roots of flamenco, the roots written with double O, but rather at the roots of flamenco with OU, right? If we really want to get a sense of what this music is about and how it has been connected with, how it has developed over time and how it has been connected with different cultural traditions. So those are the starting points, if you like, for this seminar series and for this new idea that I'd like to propose here about flamenco. We're going to talk about this in 4 different seminars, right? So we'll start with Africa today. Again, this is just a practical way of organizing the seminar, so I'm not suggesting that today I'm going to cover everything that there is to say about Africa with its, it has so many musical cultures and traditions. I don't claim to be an expert of all of those or even of a tiny part of those, but I'm trying to organize the seminar series in such a way that it is clear that in each seminar we're going to talk about a different angle to the global history of flamenco. Starting today with Africa, the next seminar in May we're going to talk about Latin America. In this 3rd seminar I'll be able to explain a bit more about my own research as well, about the connections between flamenco and the Franco dictatorship. And in the 4th seminar, we're going to talk about a very interesting film by a filmmaker from Barcelona, Isaki La Cuesta, which is going to allow us to start a conversation as well about Asia. As Pedro Eusebio already indicated in his introduction, flamenco is incredibly popular in Japan, also in China, other parts of the Asian continent. So I think this film is going to be a nice way of having a conversation about that as well. So to start at the beginning, so to say, right? This very complex topic of the contested origins of flamenco. There are very complex debates about where the term flamenco comes from exactly. And for the purposes of today's discussion, I'd like to say a bit about this hypothesis, which suggests that flamenco comes from the Arabic 2 words flamengo or flamengo, which means errant peasant. And according to this theory or this hypothesis, flamenco was born out of it was born basically in the 16th century, in the times in which the Catholic kings conquered Granada and the remaining parts of Al-Andalus, and they expelled what was left of Muslim presence on the Iberian Peninsula, persecuted those who continued to practice the Islamic faith. And those persecuted communities, the Moriscos, for example, that were Muslims who had been forced to convert themselves to Christianity. According to this theory, these communities, these persecuted communities, started mixing with gitanos and other groups that were marginalized in 16th century society. And out of the cultural mixtures and the forms of cultural exchange between these different marginalized groups emerged a musical style that basically registers as well those experiences of persecution, marginalization, repression. So it's a musical style, according to this theory, that has to do a lot with suffering, right? With repression and suffering. And the word flamenco or flamenco, which register these origins, this idea that it is essentially marginalization and repression and persecution that is at the heart of what we nowadays know as flamenco. Now, according to different scholars that have worked more in detail on this topic, this hypothesis is quite problematic in the sense that it's very hard to say to what extent the experiences of all these marginalized groups in the 16th century have really had a direct impact on flamenco. And flamenco was not really born until the late 19th century. So between the 16th and the late 19th century, there are almost 300 years, right? And in those 300 years, lots of things happened, obviously. So according to Roldan, Cristina Cruces Roldan, and other scholars, we shouldn't just say, well, you know, the origins of flamenco, this late 19th century musical style, should be located directly in the 16th century. Flamenco may definitely have received influences from all those experiences. But then again, it's very hard to locate how exactly those influences have made it into a musical repertoire that didn't really emerge until the late 19th century. And that was also influenced by other cultural traditions, like the religious music of the Byzantine and the Jewish traditions and so on. So it's, again, it's hard to establish a direct connection between those. I did want to say that there are important similarities between the music that was practiced in the times of Al-Andalus, the music that is now known as Música Andalusí, or Arabic Andalusi music, in terms of how these musical structures, how these musical styles function. And there are important similarities there with flamenco. For example, in Arabic music, a musical improvisation that usually functions as an interlude between two parts that are sung by a singer are known as taksim. And you might say that in flamenco, there's a very similar concept, the concept of the falseta, which has a very similar function. It is a musical interlude and often an improvisation, although they're all falsetas that are clearly, you know, clear cut, and they are played in exactly the same way every time. But they have a very similar musical function, and you could compare the taksim and the falseta in that sense. Something similar could be said about the coincidence between tarab and duende, generally referred to this mystical kind of soul or feeling of the musical style in question, musical feeling or the soul that only emerges on certain occasions. It's not part of the music all the time, but it can only appear or be invoked by an act of magic almost. Something similar could be said about the melodical modes that are used in Andalusi music and in Arabic music. Those modes are known as the makam. And in flamenco, we have the palos, of course, those musical genres, styles like the bulería, the soleá, alegría, right? And those styles are not only styles, they're not only rhythmical or melodical structures, they're also atmospheres, right? And alegría is not only the 12-beat rhythm with lyrics about happiness, it's also an entire atmosphere that is linked to a certain ambience, if you like. And makam has a very similar meaning or similar function in Arabic music. And finally, tab, which is also this idea that exists in Arabic music that refers to a lot of interlinked concepts, the character of a musical performance, its temperament, its nature, also these magical elements that I've spoken about earlier, and that could also be compared to certain elements in flamenco. So there are definitely important similarities, right? And it's definitely, I don't want to dismiss the impact that, you know, Arabic music and its presence for more than 7 centuries on the Iberian Peninsula has had, the impact that it has made on what we now know as Spanish culture. But the question is, should we talk about origins, and should we talk about influences? Has Arabic music directly influenced flamenco, or is it more appropriate to talk about coincidences? And as Cristina Cruces Roldan and other scholars have highlighted, it may be, according to them, more appropriate to talk about coincidences. The fact that many different musical styles from across the globe, not only Arabic music and flamenco, share many different ways of looking at music, of thinking about what music is, of experiencing music as well. And what in flamenco is known as duende may be known under a different category, under a different concept in another musical tradition. So maybe it's more appropriate to talk about coincidences than about direct influences. And having said that, this brings me then to the topic of the ways in which the legacy of Arabic music and also the wider cultural legacy of the time of Islamic presence on the Iberian Peninsula, the times of Al-Andalus, how that legacy is now used often for commercial purposes and sometimes also for political purposes in order to market flamenco and also to promote flamenco and Andalusian culture in a particular way in present-day Spanish society. So when we're talking about Al-Andalus, we're talking about the times of medieval Muslim Iberia from the year 711 until 1492, right? And an idea that is often associated with the times of Al-Andalus is the concept of convivencia, coexistence, you might say in English, this idea that during medieval times in Spain, that the different religious and cultural communities that coexisted did so in a peaceful and happy manner. The Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews, right? And the extent to which that is true, the extent to which there was really peaceful coexistence between those communities during this period has been debated in recent years. And what I personally find quite interesting about this is how this idea of convivencia has become a little bit of a discourse or a stereotype even to think not only about the past, but also to think about the present in strategical ways and to use this a little bit of this idealized image of the past for strategic purposes in the present. I'll move on to that in a second, and I'll also give you a musical illustration of that idea. Before doing that, I'd like to move on to say something about Blas Infante, who is now known as the father of Andalusian nationalism, and who wrote a series of essays in the 1930s that defend this idea that flamenco indeed emerged directly out of Arabic music and Arabic culture during its presence on the Iberian Peninsula. So this series of essays that was bundled and published in the 1980s, Orígenes de lo Flamenco y Secreto del Cantajondo, the origins of flamenco and the secrets of deep song, right? Defend this idea that it was indeed the Morisco community in combination with the Gitanos and other marginalized groups that created, in a way, what we now know as flamenco. Now, this idea has been taken up in recent years. Blas Infante is now often, he is commemorated and lauded and praised because he was, in the sense, the founder of Andalusian nationalism. And in recent times, this idea that flamenco and Arabic music are intimately related has become a little bit of a musical metaphor for a utopian reading of the past. This is a topic that has been studied by a musicologist, Matthew Machin Autenrieth, who is currently working on a very interesting research project about precisely those forms of cultural exchange between Spain and Northern Africa, and also how those forms of cultural and musical exchange have been used for diplomatic and strategic purposes. So I'm going to refer to his work on that topic as well in the next couple of slides. This idea that flamenco and music, Andalusian music are related, also automatically comes with a certain way of looking at history and looking at the present as well, this idealized utopian reading of what life was like in the past, and also how we can project those idealized images onto the present. Now, in the present, as you know, the relationship between Spanish society, but European societies in general, with communities from Northern Africa, specifically migrant communities, is often not as harmonious as this idea of convivencia would suggest, right? We've seen in recent years the rise of the far right in Spain, in Britain, in the Netherlands, and many other countries. And often migrant communities from Northern Africa are precisely stigmatized. They are considered to be dangerous others in society, a threat to the integrity of European society. So there's, you know, a lot going on, and all of that is very problematic. So the way in which I'd like to, or the reason for which I'd like to be a bit critical of this idea of convivencia and those utopian suggestions that flamenco and Arabic music are intimately related has to do with precisely this fact. The fact that migrant communities that currently live in Spain and work in Spain, or that live in other parts of Europe, their needs are often not met or taken into account by the institutions that promote these ideas of flamenco and Arabic music as being intimately linked, or this idea that in medieval times, convivencia, coexistence between those different religious and cultural communities was peaceful and harmonious. And I think we should also start by looking at the needs of, for example, Northern African musicians that work in Spain and that need to make a living by playing music. How are those people going to relate to flamenco? How can they relate to this idea that flamenco and Arabic music are intrinsically connected? And are their personal needs also met by those kinds of ideas and by those kinds of discourses? I think that is often not the case. I think those that benefit from these ideas of convivencia, or the suggestion that flamenco and Arabic music are intimately linked, are often those institutions that are more directed at promoting Spanish culture than institutions that maybe want to try and achieve some sort of a more diverse concept of Spanish culture, if you like, or that work for the migrant communities that are living and struggling in Spain and in Europe, facing discrimination, racism, and all sorts of other forms of violence, right? And that's why I think that it's important to be a little bit critical of all of this. I'll give you a musical example now. I'm only going to give you one example. I don't want to become this, for this lecture, I don't want it to be too long. But I've added a couple of references here to other interesting musical examples that you could look into, to have a look at ways in which different artists in different historical periods have tried to establish these forms of musical connection between flamenco and different varieties of Arabic music. I'm very happy for this PowerPoint presentation to be circulated after this seminar. I also believe that the seminar is going to be recorded or is being recorded. So if anybody wants to have a look at these links later, that is of course absolutely fine. Just very quickly, for example, the first example here, Lole Montoya, who is a member of an important family from Triana, the Montoya family, and who was born in Morocco, by the way. She has also performed a couple of interesting songs that are part of the repertoire of classical Arabic music. For example, this song, Alf Leila wa Leila, by the Egyptian singer Kulthum. She performs this song using the flamenco style, the tangos, as part of a series of documentary programs about flamenco that was aired on Spanish television during the Franco dictatorship, only a couple of years before the Franco dictatorship ended. And it's quite interesting because all of a sudden we see how she switches from Spanish into Arabic as part of a television series that was essentially directed at promoting flamenco as being Spanish, right? During the times of the Franco dictatorship, of course, flamenco was promoted as part of Spanish identity, and in particular the Catholic understanding of Spanish identity that the Franco regime wanted to promote. So it's quite interesting to see how, as part of this program, all of a sudden, Lole sheds an entirely new light on flamenco by incorporating this traditional song and by singing in Arabic using the rhythmical structure of the tango. So that's an interesting example to have a look at. There's some other examples here that I'm not going to go into now, but you can have a look afterwards if you'd like to. The example that I want to talk about today is part of a documentary film, a musical documentary film about the work of Enrique Morente, the flamenco singer from Granada, a documentary film that is called Morente Sueña, La Alhambra. Morente dreams the Alhambra. And the Alhambra Palace is, of course, perhaps the key location that is often associated with the heritage and the legacy of Islamic presence and Arabic presence on the Iberian Peninsula, and onto which people, musicians, artists, but also tourists and tourist industries have projected this idea of convivencia that I spoke about earlier as well. La Alhambra as this fantasy location as well, into which people can project their own myths, their desires, this idea that somehow when you go to the Alhambra, you can feel something of the traces of Islamic presence in Spain, right? And the song that I'm going to show is a performance of a song by Morente with Khaled, a singer from Algeria, at the Alhambra Palace. I'll show you a short fragment and then I'll say a couple of things about it. I'm going to have to share my screen again with you.
بحدية لفظ اللسان بك وشبق منا تواجبنا من عهدك ما بيتابع يانا حاشروني والفي الحاد يانا quiero más con yo no quiero más con porque me estoy manteniendo con la raíz del que eres porque me estoy manteniendo con la raíz del querer.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there for now. So a couple of things to say about this fragment, right? I think you've all appreciated when you just listen to the song, to the two singers, to the instruments as well, the percussion, the guitar. It all fits together quite nicely, doesn't it? They take turns in singing, performing lyrics that are, popular lyrics that are part of their respective musical traditions. They are accompanied by flamenco guitar, who can play basically in the same way in which you would accompany a flamenco singer when he plays for Khaled, because harmonically and melodically, it all is very similar in terms of how the two singers perform the lyrics, right? The percussion, this is a 6/8 rhythm. So you could say this is a bulería from the flamenco point of view, but it obviously works together with the darbuka very nicely as well. So, you know, these people, they didn't have to do an awful lot in order to make this work, in order to just play together and create a song that has influences and ingredients from the two different genres, right? From Algerian rai and from flamenco. Now, the film as a visual product, of course, contributes as well to, it also emphasizes the similarities, right? You can see quite nicely on this image how obviously the way in which the two singers are posed, they are standing next to each other, both are playing palmas with their hands in a way, so that suggests as well that they are doing the same thing, and that, you know, they seem to be similar. There seems to be some sort of fraternal relationship between them. The camera angles contribute to that as well, suggesting how they are really part of the same unique kind of moment and the same performance, right? What's also important to highlight, I think, the images from the archivos africanos, those that archival footage that we saw that was projected on top of the images from the Alhambra. Those are images that have a lot to do as well with Spain's colonial enterprise in Northern Africa. The fact that it was between the late 19th and the first half of the 20th century, that it also undertook several colonial expeditions, or often very violently, in Northern Africa. And the images that were created were part of that colonialist project as well. And that already indicates a little bit how the purpose of this film, you might say, of course, it has very good intentions. It wants to highlight the similarity. It wants to highlight, you know, cultural exchange and brotherhood even between these two cultural traditions. But those intentions are often also based on certain power struggles and hierarchies that are not immediately present if you just look at these images, if you just have a look at them at first glance, right? And to say something about this idea of convivencia and how what we're seeing here, the song as it is being performed, connects with that idea of that utopian idea of medieval Al-Andalus and convivencia. Of course, this is quite a utopian situation that you wouldn't encounter in everyday life, not least because there are no tourists at the Alhambra. You know, if we were able to go to the Alhambra without any tourists, that would automatically become a much more magical experience. But now we have to crawl over all those tourists that are there and try to take pictures while 100 people are standing in the same room and trying to take pictures as well. So obviously what we're seeing, the way in which the Alhambra is framed here, is already kind of idealized, right? And I think that you could think of this particular performance as part of what the scholar that I mentioned earlier, Matthew Machin Altenried, has called cultural diplomacy. So this is a musical documentary film that registers different performances at the Alhambra by Morente in collaboration with different singers from different parts of the world. He works with Pat Metheny, Blanca Lee, with Khaled, with other people, right? And in a way, of course, that is Morente's personal artistic project, his particular way of thinking about and dreaming the Alhambra Palace. But this is also an artistic project that is connected with the tourism industry in Granada and with certain commercial interest on behalf of cultural institutions in Andalusia, which is something that we can see when looking, for example, I have the DVD here. If you have a look at the different sponsors of this film and of this artistic project, it immediately, you can say that this, you know, the collaborating institutions are, for example, the Junta de Andalucía, the cultural institution in Andalusia, the Spanish Ministry of Culture, also the, what's its name? The Federación Provincial the Empresas de Hostelería y Turismo de Granada. So this is basically an organization that bundles and defends and promotes the interest of the tourism sector in Granada. And the fact that all those different institutions have contributed financially to this project, I think indicates how this film also, in a way, further promotes and perpetuates this idea of the Alhambra as this magical place where we just want to go in order to experience something of this idealized image of cultural exchange between the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews, or to experience a trace of this idealized notion of Spain's medieval past. So in that way, I think it's important to be aware, to conclude this part of the seminar, that it's very hard to locate the exact origins of flamenco and to trace them back to what happened in the 16th century. There are definitely important influences and coincidences between these different musical styles, but the suggestion that is being made nowadays that flamenco is directly linked with Arabic culture is often also used for commercial purposes that are often not really serving the needs of the real Muslim communities in Spain or other minorities in Spain in contemporary society. I'm going to move on now to the second and last topic of today, which has to do with another part of the African continent, sub-Saharan Africa. And this part of the connections, or this part of the history of flamenco and the different roots of flamenco has often been silenced until quite recently, thanks to the work of a scholar, a scholar like Mira Goldberg, who is a dance scholar based in New York at the City University of New York. She published this book a couple of years ago, Sonidos Negros, on the blackness of flamenco. And in a way, what Goldberg tries to do with this book is what you could call decolonize flamenco and decolonize flamenco studies. You may be aware of this discussion that is going on in society today and also at the University of Manchester, in fact, about the decolonization of history and of the curriculum, the fact that the history of colonialism and particularly of slavery is so often silenced in history books or in university curricula or in public discussions, in museums and in society at large. And the same could be said about flamenco. The African presence, the presence of African communities, of Black communities in Spain since the 16th century has often been overlooked or directly silenced or repressed. And therefore, very little is still known about the incredible, crucial impact that these communities have had on certain rhythmical and also harmonic developments that took place in music since the 16th century on the Iberian Peninsula. So Goldberg's book basically tries to address this erasure of Blackness from the history of flamenco, and that erasure has of course to do with historical political reasons and with the fact that racism is still very much embedded in all our institutions. Now, she documents, as other scholars have done. Sorry, could you please mute your microphones? I was hearing a bit of sound in the background. She documents the fact that in cities such as Seville and Cádiz, even Granada, that have been considered to be very important for the development of flamenco, that those cities had very large Black communities, in particular in the 16th and 17th century. Seville and Cádiz, of course, due to their crucial role in the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. So there were a lot of slaves that lived in Seville and Cádiz, but also former slaves that were liberated and then stayed in Iberia and stayed in Seville and Cádiz and became part of the communities of those cities. That is something that is often not known, and it is also often overlooked in the history of flamenco studies. And to make things a bit more complex even, where exactly are we going to look for the traces of Blackness in flamenco? And I'm writing Blackness here with a capital, as Goldberg and other scholars have done as well, because I'm not only talking about skin color, but I'm talking about blackness as this wider ideological construct as well that comes with loads of negative stereotypes and forms of hierarchies and violence and racial forms of racial stereotypes, right? So where exactly are we going to look for the traces of blackness in flamenco? There are certainly flamenco songs with lyrics that refer to Black subjects, Black individuals, or Black communities, and Goldberg documents some of them. But it may even be more interesting to look at ways in which flamenco dance styles have been influenced by the Black communities in 16th century Spain, or how flamenco rhythms, those very complex polyrhythms that we often know that flamenco is known for, how those aspects of flamenco have been influenced by Black communities as well. And of course, when talking about dance movements and when talking about the body, we're not talking about written words that can be found in archives. We're talking about bodies and bodily movements. And those bodies, of course, are not there anymore. The bodies of those who performed music in the 16th and 17th centuries, we can't just see how they danced. We need to rely on written sources from the archives. And even those written sources often are not very reliable, or these Black individuals are often not even part of those written sources because their history has precisely been repressed and silenced and so on. So this is a very complex topic, right? But therefore, all the more interesting and all the more relevant to have a conversation about. And there are a couple of sources that give a little bit of insight into ways in which possibly Black communities since the 16th century may have contributed to the very complex rhythms and harmonies and dance movements that we now associate with flamenco. And there are two sources that I'm going to highlight before concluding. One is this amazing documentary film by Miguel Ángel Rosales, which is entitled Curumbe from 2016. I believe that it's not available on DVD yet. They did tour the US and went to different institutions with this film. I'm not sure whether the film has been screened in the UK already, so that might be something to consider for the Instituto Cervantes as well. And this film basically talks about the blackness of flamenco, the rhythmical and also the ingredients in dance, in flamenco dance, that according to different people that speak in this film could be traced back to the Black communities that lived in Spain and also that were forced to go to the American colonies and to work as slaves there. And there's a very interesting figure, Raúl Rodríguez, shown here on the left, who is a musician, also an anthropologist, a scholar, and he talks about these issues. I'm going to show a fragment from a song that he wrote later, and he talks about the ways in which perhaps the rhythms of flamenco and the ways in which those rhythms are performed contain traces from the Black communities of the 16th century. The rhythms of music from sub-Saharan Africa, as Rodriguez explains as well in this film, those rhythms are almost always played on drums, right? On drums. In flamenco, there are no drums present. And all the percussion that is traditionally associated with flamenco is the percussion that comes from the hands, from the body directly, the palmas, right? And according to Rodriguez, maybe musicians have started incorporating the rhythms and the percussion that was traditionally played on drums by African performers and have incorporated those rhythms directly into their bodies. Not only because the rhythms of flamenco are so complex, but also because the way in which those rhythms are performed, as Rodriguez explains in the film, have to do a lot with finding yourself and establishing a connection with the ground that you're standing on, right? Palmas are often not played just by clapping, but also often the feet are needed to really breathe and to really experience the rhythm the rhythms of different flamenco styles. So maybe it's by incorporating those drum beats into the body that we can still sense something of what I've now started calling the blackness of flamenco. Another figure to highlight here is Yinka Essie Graves, who is a dancer that now lives in Spain. She's originally from Britain. I think she grew up in London. And she has been working on very interesting projects as well about the heritage of African communities in flamenco, and also has organized several workshops. I've listened to a couple of her interviews online, in which she tries to open up the idea of what flamenco dance is about, and also the kind of heritage that people should associate with flamenco. So she really tries to incorporate the legacy and the heritage of diasporic African communities into her own ways of practicing and teaching flamenco dance. So that is another very interesting and important scholar and also artist that has contributed to this discussion about the blackness of flamenco. I'm now going to show a song that was that was written by Raúl Rodríguez. It is, you can find it on YouTube, but he also recorded it on his album, Razón de Son. And I'm going to play the song first, and then I'll say a little bit about the lyrics. Oh, sorry. Just going to play a small, short fragment.
Voy a contarles mi historia, y aunque alguno se la sabe, les regalaré la llave del hueco de mi memoria. Yo no tengo aquella gloria que otros flamencos tuvieron, porque de ellos sí escribieron los que tenían buena pluma. A mí se me debe una canción que no compusieron. Negro Kuro de Triana, yo nací en Andalucía, por eso curros me decían cuando aparecí en La Habana. Aquella tierra era hermana del mundo que conocí. Yo no soy calavarín, ni guineo ni congo, yo soy flamenco y compongo el son que me gusta a mí.
Okay, just to give you an impression of the song. 1 second. So the title of the song is El Negro Kuro, which is a concept that Rodríguez has taken from a Cuban anthropologist. And the Negros Kuros are, according to that Cuban anthropologist, Fernando Ortiz, is a community of a Black community that lived in Cuba, in La Habana, specifically in that city, in the 19th century. And these were former slaves that had traveled to Cuba. They were slaves in Spain, they had lived in Spain, and then they traveled to Cuba and started a new life there and established a new community there as former slaves. So they had already been liberated. And that community came to be known as the Negros Kuros in Fernando Ortiz's term. And Rodríguez is talking about this community in Cuba that, of course, since it had lived in Spain before, in a way, its heritage is divided between Cuba, Spain, and Africa, between those three continents. And in order to establish that connection through music, Rodríguez is playing a song here that follows the rhythmical pattern of the bulería, the 6/8 rhythmical structure. He plays not on a flamenco guitar, but on a tres cubano, right? And he sings the following lyrics. Yo no tengo aquella gloria. I don't have had the pleasure or the glory that other flamencos did have, because lyrics were written about those other flamencos by those writers who were skillful writers, los que tenían buena pluma. A mí se me debe una canción que no compusieron. They still owe me a song that never has been composed. So basically, Rodriguez adopts the perspective of a former slave who had lived in Spain, then traveled to Cuba, and established himself in Cuba, who has been excluded from the history of flamenco and whose voice has been silenced in flamenco history. And Rodriguez precisely wants to incorporate that voice into the flamenco repertoire in quite an interesting way, I think. And by combining all those different musical elements, the rhythms, the instrument, the lyrics, by suggesting that flamenco and Spain is a very reductive picture, that flamenco is also related to Africa and also to the Americas. The final example, and I'm not going to show the video fragment, but you can have a look at the trailer of this show that was released only last year, only a couple of months ago, actually, which is called Gugurumbe. The title is similar to the documentary film Gurumbe. Both of them refer to a villancico, a Christmas carol from the 16th century that was composed by a Catalan composer, Mateo Fletxa. And that song is also a parody on Christian Christmas carols as performed by slaves in Spain. So that's why they've chosen the title of this song. You can find the song online as well, Gugurumbe by Mateo Fletxa. And this is a collaboration between an African dancer, a flamenco dancer, flamenco singer, flamenco guitarist, and a musical ensemble led by Fahmy Alkay, who is a civilian born. He is born in Seville, but he is Palestinian and Syrian as well. He has established this ensemble that basically performs traditional music from the 16th, 17th century, from the Baroque. And as Alkay has explained in the documentary film and also as part of this program, the rhythmical revolution that took place in Spain in the 16th and 17th century, the incorporation of all these complex polyrhythms, cannot be understood if we don't look at the contributions of the Black communities that lived in Spain at that time. Those complex polyrhythms, like that we know nowadays in the seguirilla and flamenco as well, the 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, da, 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 da. He plays a couple of songs from the Baroque repertoire that use the same rhythmical patterns. And according to Alkay and other musicians that speak in the documentary and in the show, those are basically ingredients that come from the music of Black communities, of slave communities in medieval Iberia. So it might be interesting to have a look at this show as well. Also looking at how these musicians are trying to create a new image for what a flamenco performance looks like. And new forms of costume, new instruments, new interactions between the different musicians as a way of opening up the flamenco repertoire, opening up the imagery that is associated with flamenco in order to include something of that very complex history of Blackness that until now has been silenced. And I'm going to stop there. What I tried to do in this seminar basically is to explain that these discussions about the roots with double O, or the origins of flamenco, are often not only very complex, but sometimes they ask questions that don't really have an answer. And instead of looking at those roots with double O, maybe it's more instructive to look at the cultural roots of flamenco and at its different connections with different cultural traditions in different historical periods. When talking about the connections between flamenco and Africa, which was basically the main topic of this seminar, I think there's an important distinction between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And as I tried to explain, the connections between flamenco and North Africa have often been emphasized for strategic, commercial, or ideological purposes. Whereas the connections between flamenco and Sub-Saharan Africa have often been silenced for, as well, political reasons and because of the ongoing presence of racism in many institutions and in society at large, right? And what I think is, what I found when preparing for the seminar, and what I think is very promising and very interesting to look at in the future, is that flamenco is increasingly becoming a combination of art and scholarship as well. It's not only about performing the art form as such and about playing the music or dancing flamenco styles, but it's also about doing research and through art trying to incorporate new forms of knowledge about flamenco into the public sphere. And I think this is something that can be seen, for example, the Academia Piacere, the work of Yinka S.C. Graves, the work of Raúl Rodriguez, and some of the other musicians that I've mentioned here. All of them work with a little bit in this in-between space between art and scholarship. And I think it's interesting to look at the work of those people because they're going to help us think about not only what flamenco is and where it has come from, but also more relevantly, perhaps, to think about what flamenco can still be or what it can still become for all of us, right? So I'd like to leave it there. In the next seminar, we're going to talk about a missing link in today's seminar, basically, because when we're talking about colonialism and the slave trade, we cannot understand that history without talking about the Americas. And we're going to talk about the tango and the fandango, two very important flamenco styles whose history cannot be properly understood if we don't also incorporate the Americas and the colonial period into that story. And finally, in the next seminar, I'm also going to talk a little bit about recent developments in flamenco, how flamenco and Latin jazz have become, or how interesting dialogues between those musical traditions have been established in recent years. And I'm going to try and say something about that as well, and possible historical reasons for that, and also how those jazz musicians, for example, here in the Café Berlin in Madrid, which has become a very important venue for the crossover performances between flamenco and jazz, how these venues are also contributing to new forms of thinking about and new ways of practicing flamenco. So yeah, that's everything for today. I'm going to stop now. These are the sources that I've used, and if anyone wants to have a look at these, I'm very happy for this PowerPoint presentation to be circulated. So thanks very much for your attention, and very happy to discuss this further if there are any questions or any comments.
Thank you very much, Carlos. It was great. And now we are open for discussion. What we will do, as we mentioned at the beginning, I will go through the chat so we can put you the questions from the public. So, sorry. There is a comment from Heather Marcano. When you are trying to understand what's in flamenco, actually in song's letra, do you need to know some Arabic to really understand?
Yeah, that's a good point. There are certain theories that some of the words that are commonly used in flamenco performances have an Arabic origin as well. For example, jaleo in particular, ole, agua, those kinds of concepts, according to some theorists, have an Arabic origin as well. And of course, there are many words in Spanish in general that have Arabic origin. So there are definitely lyrics, I think, that can be understood a bit better if you have knowledge of Arabic as well. I don't speak Arabic, to be perfectly honest with you, so I wouldn't be able to pinpoint or to say, well, this lyric uses that word from Arabic or whatever. But yeah, I think that knowing Arabic can be, very helpful to understand more about the language of flamenco, its musical language, but also the lyrics in particular, the jaleos, the oles, the aguas, and those kinds of things.
Okay, then there is, sorry, there is a comment. Just a minute, sorry. Yes, there is somebody who says, my husband is from Bangladesh. First time here flamenco, said it looks like lots of traditional Bangladesh music.
Yeah. I mean, that might be something that we could come back to in the last seminar on Asia. And I think that, other other musicians as well have worked on the crossovers and the connections between Indian music, the ragas and the palos flamencos, how important rhythmical improvisation is in those very complex polyrhythmical structures. So yeah, I think that other connections can be found. There are important similarities between Arabic music and flamenco, but there are, people from other parts of the world will recognize similarities with their particular musical heritage as well. So music from Bangladesh, I could perfectly imagine that you can hear connections there as well. Absolutely.
So there is a comment from Agil Samani, says another example for the meeting of three cultures, Iran, Spain, and Syria is there, please. So there is a link for the people who might be interested to see this example. Yes, the next question is, yes, Sara Mitra said also, I would like to recommend the film Gurumbe, Canciones de Memoria Negra. Jan McNair say, I thought when you referred to internal outsiders, you will refer to the Gitano presence and how Roma communities across Europe have absorbed and reformed, popular music from which we were often then played back to the wider community by Roma Gitano communities. Your outline seems to collude with the popular desire to obliterate the importance of this community, and your examination of the exhausted relationship between flamenco and Spain did not refer to the very strong element outside of Andalusia of content for the music, both for its links to Gitanos and as well the antagonism, especially in Catalonia, for all Andalusian culture. Hope these themes will emerge in the future sessions. Yes.
Yeah, that's a very, very valid comment. Absolutely. Thanks very much for that as well. It was not at all my intention, of course, to overlook or to suggest to dismiss the importance of the Gitano communities. And maybe I could have said a little bit more about Spain's internal others, of which the Gitano community is perhaps the most important one. I think, yeah, just in terms of the fact that the connections between flamenco and the Gitano community in Spain has been studied quite extensively by other scholars. So I think it was basically a question of trying to highlight certain aspects that have not been studied as much without suggesting that the Gitanos have not been important for flamenco or whatever. But yeah, thanks very much for that comment. I take that point.
Yes, there are so many comments and questions, so maybe I go just, everybody can read the comments, so I will go through the questions. The next one, it says, what kind of sources are there for the idea of flamenco or originating sub-Saharan?
What kind of sources are for the, yeah, so there are, well, as I try to highlight, sources are always an issue when talking about these issues. Firstly, because we have to rely, when talking about historical periods that are so far away in time, we have to deal with written sources, mostly with archives. And then those archives have their own internal dynamics and power dynamics as well. So often sources that could help us understand more about Black communities are just not available because they have never been written, or because they are just not present in the archives anymore. There are written sources mainly that tell us about the presence of slave communities in Spain, in 16th and 17th century Spain. So by looking at those sources, we can of course establish that there were large communities, and there are sources also that document the musical performances and practices of those communities. So that helps us understand a bit more about their particular language, ways in which their bodies, they use their bodies for dance styles, their rhythms as well. There are musicologists that have done important work on the rhythms of African music and how they reached music in Spain in the 16th century. Well, it wasn't known as Spain then at the time. Those are the kinds of sources that we have to look at. But if you really want to establish to what extent the drum beats of African music, for example, are still palpable, present in palmas, I think that is very complex, because there are no real sources that can help us understand that directly.
Yes, there is somebody who says, I was recently told by a Croatian anthropologist that tracing the gypsies from India via Egypt is incorrect, actually, and that the WHTA is known as Rome, probably originally came from regions near Croatia. So that is the question, if the gypsies are originally from a region near Croatia, and rather than other theory that says that they come from India.
Yeah, I'm not sure the different theories, right, about the origins of the Gitanos. They may have come, or well, this is such a complex debate in itself. I don't claim to be a specialist on Gitano scholarship or Gypsy scholarship. Even the term that we should use to talk about these communities is under dispute, right? But yeah, some say that they come from Egypt, others from India, that they were part of the lowest caste of Indian society, the musicians and so on, and thereafter went to Eastern Europe, and then from Eastern Europe arrived at Spain. Yeah, I'm not in a position to say which perspective is correct, which one is incorrect. I can only say it's a very complex history, and yeah, it is something that requires its own talk, actually.
Yes,
yeah.
of course. Agil Tamani says, so thank you for your presentation. You spoke about cante, flamenco, and roots. For example, what is the difference between Soleá de Cádiz or Alcalá?
Yeah, those those different denominators are often used to refer to a variety of the Soleá that was created in one specific city or one specific part of Andalusia, right? So Alcalá refers to Alcalá de Guadaira in the Seville province. Cádiz refers to Cádiz, because singers that used to sing the Soleá in those different areas contributed their own melodic varieties, their own ways of timing the lyrics as well. And that's how those different varieties were born, basically. So they are associated with, yeah, a couple of influential singers that helped develop the repertoire of the Soleá by adding new melodies, new rhythmical interpretations, etc.
So there are quite a lot of people thank you and saying that it was very interesting, and many comments also. Maybe we have to go near ending the presentation, but somebody says, many thanks, Carlos. I was captivated by the film Carlos Saura in 1980, presenting the kind of flamenco, our most cinema. And yes, amazing thanks. Somebody says it is maybe that Gypsy's influence, contribution, aspect of flamenco is later than earlier African influence.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
That is how it's formulated, the question. It's no, maybe it's not,
I'm reading it here now, yeah.
Is it maybe that Gypsy's influence, contribution, and the spread of flamenco is later than earlier African influence? But I understand it's asking that if the influence from the Gypsies are from the origin rather than the African influence, or previous to the African origin.
Yeah, that might be the case. I mean, African slaves started to arrive at, Iberia when Spain started to build its colonial empire, which was from 1492 onwards. Although there are also documents that highlight that even during the times of Al-Andalus, slaves were already part of the courts of different, different parts of Al-Andalus. But yeah, it is, as far as I understand it, it is basically that Black communities in Iberia became larger in the 16th and 17th centuries. And yeah, we can assume that the Gitanos were already present in Iberia at that time. I spoke about the Moriscos and their alliances with the Gitanos earlier. So that might perfectly be the case. I'd have to look into that as well. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Carlos. It was really very, very interesting. And this is the aim of this seminar. Those seminars is to show how rich, how complex, and how joyful is the flamenco. So I hope you have enjoyed this seminar, and we wait for you all for the next occasion. And we will have also quite a lot flamenco in our program, but that would be after June, when we will be able to have concerts and face-to-face cultural activities. Thank you very much to everybody for being there. And as Carlos mentioned, this had been recorded, so you can watch, or you can share this video or the seminar to your friends or your acquaintance. So thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.